My name is Lynn James, and this is Target 2 on schedules of reinforcement on a fixed ratio of random ratio on a childhood fish and an at-risk population. Delayed discounting was produced in the current study. Delayed discounting is influenced on a delayed reward, decreasing the function of the specific delay. An example of this would be having the reinforcer immediately or receiving the reward in a later time frame. The immediate reinforcer would have a greater reward now than it would be in like 10 years. A study done by Richard on the effects of reduced cigarette smoking on discounting future rewards, an initial evaluation demonstrated this study. The article took smokers and placed them into a contingency management conditions and control group. The procedure reinforced reduction in smoking to all subjects exposed to the procedure. The discounting decreased for individuals whose smoking reductions were reinforced for both cigarettes and money. The control group showed no significant change in either commodity, and a variety of these studies have indicated that a reduction in smoking can affect discounting. Another study done by Mitchell had smokers choose between cigarettes now and money later. The results indicated that individuals would rather choose cigarettes now than money later. Another study conducted by Brickell conducted discounting for smokers who have been absent for 1 year or longer compared to smokers and non-smokers. The discounting of money from absent smokers were less than those of the current non-smokers. Two kinds of reinforcement can be conducted during the delayed questionnaire. They are larger later reinforcer and smaller sooner reinforcer. Larger later reinforcer is when you receive a large amount of a preferred reinforcer but at a later time. An example of this would be, would you rather have $10 now or $1,000 in 5 years? And the individual would choose $1,000 in 5 years. The smaller sooner reinforcer is the opposite. An individual would receive a preferred reinforcer now, then have it in 5 years. The example mentioned for just now, where the individuals would rather receive $100 now or $1,000 in 5 years, for the smaller reinforcer, they would choose $100. In this study, two schedules of reinforcement of larger later reinforcer and smaller sooner reinforcer were conducted on a childhood fish in completing a task. The results showed that the effort of the fish changed in completing each task when placed on a specific reinforcement schedule. For the human participant study, 10 individuals were in an at-risk population and 10 were in a control. Both were involved in a discounting curve. The at-risk population were smokers who had smoked more than 2 packs a week, and the smokers were given 2 discounting surveys to complete. The first survey assessed the present value of commodity across several delays, and the second survey assessed the commodity across several probabilities. A total of 20 individuals of an at-risk population were selected. A group of 10 individuals were in the control group, and 10 individuals were at-risk population. The at-risk population were evaluated on a Fagerstorm tolerance questionnaire. This test was to see how much nicotine dependence each individual was on. All participants completed a consent form prior to partaking in the experiment. Before conducting the survey, both groups performed the Fagerstorm tolerance questionnaire to determine if the participants were eligible for the current study. Once scores were calculated, the discounting surveys were given to both the at-risk population and control group on temporal delay. Both surveys only consisted of 23 questions. The first survey assessed present value of commodity across several different delays. For example, would you rather receive $5 now or $10 in 10 hours? Once the temporal surveys were completed, participants were given the second survey assessing commodity. The second survey assessed the commodity across several probabilities. For example, would you rather have 100% chance of receiving $1 now or 50% chance of receiving $3. After the completion of both surveys, data was then done for each group and discounting curves for both groups were completed across probability and temporal delay. Subjects for both groups did not differ in demographics or on the Bagstrom tolerance questionnaire. The study indicated that individuals would rather receive their reinforcer immediately instead of having to wait 95 days or more. The one person would wait 90 days and receive $100, but the remainder would get the smaller, sooner reinforcer. To calculate the curvature, V is the present value of the delayed reward, A is the delay of which 100 after the amount of delays, K is the rate of discounting, and the value of K in this study was 0.1923, which is considered to be a low value. This indicated low levels of impulsivity. The participants involved in the control group for temporal survey also showed a downward slope with light curvature at the end. A few participants said that they would take the $7 now instead of the $100 in 105 days. After that, all participants would rather wait to receive $100 later. When conducting probability for the at-risk population, one individual was impulsive enough to receive 120 with a 5% chance instead of choosing 100% probability of having $100. For the control group, two participants picked the 5% chance of receiving $120. The study was able to assess the present value of commodity over several delays and probability. The next study, one adult electric childhood male fish was used for the study. The fish was placed in a 10-gallon training tank with no lid, and the water was kept at 70 degrees throughout the entire experiment. For the procedure, before the reinforcement schedule was conducted, training first took place during feeding time to influence the correct responding of swimming through the hoop. Once the fish mastered going through the hoop by following the feeding wand, reinforcement schedule was introduced. After a fixed ratio of 1, the fish was given a smaller, sooner reinforcer of its food. This was done in 4 trials. The fish came immediately to get the reinforcer. The next trial, the fish was given a larger, later reinforcer after it completed the fixed ratio of 1 going through the hoop. A total of 4 trials were also completed, and the fish was reinforced after 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 12 seconds, and 30 seconds. The results indicated that once the fish completed swimming through the hoop, it immediately swam to the opening of the wand. The fish only received a small amount of food, not the whole 5.0 millimeters of pellets. There was an increase in motivation to go through the hole when conducting the smaller, sooner reinforcer schedule. For larger, later reinforcer, trials of the graph showed a downward slope from 5 to 30 seconds. The fish also needed more prompting to swim through the hoop, as seen in the video on the last couple slides. By looking at the data, there was an increase in frequency on the amount of times the fish went through the hoop and received the reinforcement prior to conducting the reinforcement schedule. An assessment was done comparing 2 concurrent schedules of reinforcement on a childhood fish and an at-risk population. Baseline phase of both studies demonstrated no identifiable preference between the 2 schedules of reinforcement. The at-risk group conducted 2 discounting surveys and were given to assess the present value of commodity. The first survey assessed commodity across different temporal delays, and the second survey assessed commodity across several probabilities. The result of the first study indicated that they would prefer receiving the reinforcer right away than later. For the second survey, individuals would rather receive the higher probability of receiving more money than a 100% chance of receiving the lower value of $100. The fish was placed on 2 schedules of reinforcement that were larger, later reinforcement and smaller, sooner reinforcement. The fish showed more involvement in completing the task that he knew he was going to receive immediate reinforcement than larger, later reinforcement. The 2 studies are similar to each other by examining the reinforcement schedule of whether or not they would receive reinforcement. Both subjects would rather receive immediate 100% certainty than a 50% chance of receiving a reinforcer later. A couple of limitations were involved in the present study. The first limitation was their discounting results may have been spurious for the at-risk population, although it is unlikely that at-risk individuals are not actually receiving the reinforcement directly, which may lead to data being spurious. Another limitation conducted in the study was not being able to examine the study in person and give the reinforcer to the participants to see if that had an increase in their responses. The next limitation was the temporal curve that did not show much of a curvature, but the curve did show going in a downward slope. Some limitations for the fish experiment too was a change in its environment. Halfway through the experiment, the tank contacts were changed, which also may have influenced the data for the later, larger reinforcer. And then another limitation was that the experiment was on a time constraint. So for the larger, later reinforcement, the fish had to be prompted, which resulted in biased results. The understanding of the relationship between temporal delays can have a significant impact on individuals' understanding behavior consequences of reinforcement. This is an example of the sooner, smaller reinforcement. This is the second, larger, later reinforcement where the fish needed heavy prompting in order for it to go through the hoop during the 30-second interval of reinforcement.